Good evening, everybody. My name is Christian Ramirez, and I will be refuting Thomas DeLone's claim of fact speech. His main claim was capital punishment is detrimental to our society. He has two secondary claims. His first is the death penalty was reinstated in 1978. California has spent roughly $4 billion in associated costs. His second, the application of capital punishment is full of inequality. My main claim is capital punishment is beneficial to our society. My first secondary claim with that is life without parole is more expensive than the death penalty in many cases. My second point will be capital punishment is fair in a legal system such as our government. Thomas says California spent $4 billion in associated costs. He also says in Colorado, housing a death row prisoner is 17% more than housing an inmate. My response to that is life without parole is more expensive than the death penalty in many cases. Thomas just states the cost for California only. My first point, life without parole, in many cases costs more than death sentence, and I found Dudley Sharp, Death Penalty Resources Director for Justice for All, JFA, wrote, many opponents present as fact that the cost of the death penalty is so expensive that we must choose life without parole at a cost of $1 million for 50 years. Predictably, these pronouncements may be entirely false. JFA estimates that life without parole cases will be $1.2 to $3.6 million more than equivalent death penalty cases. My second point, a prisoner who is alive will have nothing better to do but use up resources that require money. Edwin H. Sutherland, PhD, late president of the American Sociology Society, wrote, it is not cheaper to keep a criminal confined because most of the time he will appeal just as much, causing as many costs as a convict under death sentence. Being alive, having nothing better to do, he will spend his time in prison conceiving of ever new habeas corpus petitions, which being unlimited, in effect cannot be rejected as res judicata. The cost is higher. Res judicata is a rule that a final judgment is the last and final decision. Habeas corpus, writs of habeas corpus are used to review the legality of the party's arrest, imprisonment, or detention. Prisoners can use habeas corpus, which can cost millions of dollars, and res judicata is outruled. Thomas says the application of capital punishment is full of inequality. His first point with that is variations of death sentence differ from state to state. However, with a single state, you would expect little to no variation, but that is not always the case. His second point is race plays in applications of the death penalty. Those who kill white victims are more likely to receive a death sentence than those who kill black victims. My secondary claim to that is capital punishment is fair in a legal system such as our government. My first point, capital punishment is reserved for those criminals who committed the most evil of crimes, not just anyone. Walter Burns, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, wrote, the insistence of the Supreme Court, the death penalty states have carved from first-degree murder, a still narrower category of the most heinous killings, and have rendered them alone subject to capital punishment. And in that same reading, I found a couple statistics. 20% of those on the death row committed murders during the commission of a rape or sexual assault. 10% of them committed murder during a burglary or home invasion. 13% murdered a child, and 37% committed a murder involving more than one victim. My second point, race plays no role in application of capital punishment. In the Ohio State Journal of Criminal Law, I read a 200 variable model based on the procedural reform database shows a statistically significant race of the victim effect at work on the prosecutor's decision making. But that model is totally invalid, for it contains no variable for strength of the evidence, a factor which has universally been accepted as one which plays a large part in influencing decisions by prosecutors. Neither model produces any evidence that race of the victim or race of the defendant has any statistically significant effect on the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. The Supreme Court has ruled that the death penalty is not a per se violation of the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment, but the Eighth Amendment does shape certain procedural aspects regarding when a jury may use the death penalty and how it must be carried out. In conclusion, generally, capital punishment is more cost efficient than life without parole, and is fair in decisions, making it beneficial to our society. On a side note, a weakness I saw in Thomas's speech was his sources only applied to California and Colorado. An example is when it came to his claim that race plays a role in applications of the death penalty, his only source was modern studies show. That gave me no indication of an authority for that statement. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right, well, you basically have created a counterclaim argument, and your supporting claims are parallel to the claims being presented by the advocate, and that's okay if that's what you want to do. It's a little confusing sometimes, but you did make the applications in the right spot, so it's, we can follow it pretty well. One of the problems, though, is that I don't think that you get as much contrast with the advocate's evidence and reasoning as we might have otherwise, because you are really making this counter argument as a way to respond to that. And that's especially true on the first point where you're talking about the cost issue, where I don't really recall what the evidence was that the advocate presented on this, except that it's a reference to California and they spent $4 billion over a period of time. And your evidence really does attack what the cost is per person for a life sentence, and then the argument that says that appeals would continue. I think that those are both reasonable arguments, but I don't know that they certainly don't deny the advocate's claim that death penalty is costly. There's just a question of what the comparative costs are and what is the basis of that comparison. You seem to be making the assumption that it's the appeals process, and you have a good argument that applies to that. But like I said, I think without knowing what the advocate's evidence on this, and if the advocate didn't have good evidence on this point, if the only thing they had was the statistic or the data about how much the state of California has spent on this, then I think that you've got grounds to say this is clearly much more believable on my position, because I'm quantifying it not in total over a period of years, but what each person convicted would be represent in terms of cost, and then just make the argument that's a better way to make that comparison. On the second issue on inequality, again, I think you've got good counterclaims here, and I suspect that they apply pretty closely to the advocate's claim. There was that state-by-state comparison, and then within the state assumption that things have to work a particular way. The fairness argument, of course, is a value claim, what's fair. The question is there anything that is particularly discriminatory? That's the argument. So I think that maybe get rid of the word fair and talk about whether or not it is discriminatory in any way. I think that would be a better application of the concept. Yeah, but you had a good set of statistics that talked about the kinds of killings that get subjected to these punishments, and then you had an excellent reference to the models that were being used to say that there was in fact some difference, and found no statistical or significant difference in this because they don't account for the strength of the evidence that's being involved there. The fact that somebody is more likely to be convicted because they're more clearly guilty has nothing to do with their ethnicity, and I think that that's the good point on that particular point. The last argument that you made, I think that's the kind of thing that you needed to have in the body of the argument, where you said, his evidence is only Colorado and California. I've given you data that's nationwide. I've given you data from an Ohio study that looked at this particular issue. And we talked about in California what the cost would be up above, for instance. I think comparatively my evidence is better. Do that kind of contrast a little bit more. All right, thank you.